The Minority Report, Protecting the Minorities and Marginalized. Please welcome on stage Katherine, Saeed Naqvi and Salil Tripathi.
Hello everyone. I'm going to hold the mic close to my mouth because I have a very sore throat. So my apologies before we start today. We have a huge topic and two very distinguished speakers, one on my left, one on my right. On my left is Saeed Naqvi. People have seen him on television, have read him in newspapers. He's written books, the most recent being The Other, What It Means Being a Muslim in India. And to my right is Katherine, who's of course known as a writer for The New Yorker, but more importantly and more recently, the play which I've seen, which is based on the book she wrote, Beyond the Beautiful Forevers, which is very well done, in-depth, deep reporting example of trying to understand life in urban India and the poor parts of urban India. We were to have one more panelist, Farhana Zisfani. She is not well. She would have brought a lot to the conversation because she works on minorities in Pakistan. Now I'm going to look at my phone, but that's not because I'm tweeting or Facebooking, but that's where my notes are. So trust me, and if you don't, believe me, that's all I can say. Right, so I think we are at a very interesting time in history, politically, and if we go back, if we look at the sweep around the world, we have the Philippines with Duterte as a president who represents an extremely majoritarian view of the world. We have Turkey with Erdogan. We have here in India, Narendra Modi, who clearly represents a majoritarian view. And where I live, which is London, last year there was a vote to leave the European Union, which in many ways was fueled by anxieties over migrants and immigrants who are coming into the country. And of course, the big issue in the room is, or the elephant in the room, is the symbol of the elephant is of the Republican Party and in the election of Donald Trump as the President of the United States, which also has significant impact on what it means. So is this a majoritarian revolt in the world? Saeed, maybe I'll start with you and then Katherine, what do you think about it?
To begin with, thank you so much. I am particularly flattered to be placed here on the panel with Katherine, whose book, in fact, I think is one of the finest I have read this decade. And so I really am flattered to be on the panel with you. You know how to frame this discussion, we must have a time frame. We can't begin with Adam and Eve. And the time frame I very arbitrarily like to fix is the year of the Lord 1990.
Right.
Several things happen. The Soviet Union collapses. Partly linked to that, you have economic reforms announced by Prime Minister P.V. Narasimha Rao. He invents Manmohan Singh as his finance minister, and economic reforms begin almost in the shadow of the collapse of the Soviet Union. Instead of it being one system had won, another system had been defeated, instead of the outcome being benign, and it would be romantic of anyone to expect a benign outcome out of power politics, instead of being sold as a victory of democracy, of human rights, of the human condition, it was immediately marketed globally as a huge victory of the market. The market had won. And that is how it was sold. Immediately, if I might set the scene, and then we can take, maybe Katherine has a different perspective. Immediately, the first imprimatur is placed on this victory of one system over another by the United States in the form of Operation Desert Storm. Desert Storm, February 1992, begins actually in December the previous year, 91. You have American power in alliance with the British. A coalition of the willing is created, and the attack on Baghdad takes place. Now, something very important happens that day, which many of us have not noticed, and which we ignore only to our peril. On the terrace of Al Rashid Hotel of Baghdad, I was also there with my little camera team. My friend Peter Arnett inaugurates something which has the significance of which we must realize. For the first time, the world saw a war in its drawing rooms. A live global television was born that day. BBC, John Simpson was going around with his satellite telephone, with his radio cast. There was this was the first time that a power, the global media was born, and those of you who remember it watched a war in your drawing rooms. Now, what happened is that this war, which was fought, it was triumphalism for one part of the world. The West had won, and it was very triumphant. Iraq was being pummeled, but by the same token, you had Iraq and the entire Muslim world humiliated, defeated, angry. One telecast had divided the world into two hostile audiences. This is precisely the time we did not have multiple televisions here. We had one Doordarshan. I remember it when Babri. What happens then is that a copycat television, there's a mushrooming because in the shadow of the economic reforms, advertising is required. And advertising brings into being multiple channels. 50, 60, 70, now heaven knows how many hundred channels are born. And they pick up the impulse, exactly that the division. The world was divided into two hostile camps by the same telecast. Exactly the same thing happens in India. The same set, whether it was the bombing of Afghanistan or the bombing of Iraq, you in this country created two sets of audiences. One was sympathetic to the victorious triumphalism. The other was quiet and sullen. That, to me, is the framework within which you are the one that you are. So, I just wanted to set that.
That's
here.
fair. And in fact, that was my next question, which you anticipated, which is the issue about the end of liberalism and the whole Fukuyama hypothesis about the end of history. Reflecting on that global scene, the way Saeed articulated it, if we go back to the whole issue of majoritarianism and minorities, how do you see the situation?
Well, as a journalist, I believe that I'm wary of totalizing theories and hot takes. The issues in the Philippines are different than the issues in rural United States and Hull, UK. That said, I've worked in a lot of poor communities around the world. In India, obviously, in the United States, in Mexico, in Germany, and there's one thing that really stands out for me. In nearly every community that I've worked in, what people want way more, what people care about way more than the ethnic identity of their neighbors is they want stable work. They want work for their families.
They what?
They want stable work. They want work there for their families, work that has some kind of upward mobility built into that. That's what people really want. But the problem is that technology is creating quite a significant decline in permanent work. It's going to continue. It's going to become much, much worse than it is now. There's going to be a huge amount of surplus labor. Already people's economic anxiety is extreme because of this decline in work. And then think about it from the point of view of the politician. In the Philippines, here in India, in the UK, in the United States, you have a choice as a politician. You can address this absolutely fundamental and terrible change in the society, the decline of work, by promoting complex and costly programs to address that. Or you can do something else, something more expedient, and that is to make your solution to all the problems that exist in many countries of the world a problem of immigration, a problem of outsiders. You can propose simple caps on immigration. You can create a policy that vilifies people who are not in the majority. And therefore, you can superficially solve a problem that instead should be wrestled with deeply by people all over the world. And a problem that politicians are avoiding by diminishing and censoring people who are not in their party. And I think it's a terrible crisis.
So what you're saying is that the inability to meet the economic expectations allows a leader to take steps to either discriminate on grounds of language, race, religion, class, or caste, as the case might be. Now, those are the typical dividing terms that people use. But still there are some other communities which don't get talked about, and I wanted us also to reflect on. One is the LGBT community. And I've got another question related to India following later, and the refugees. Now, in that context, what do we mean by majority and minority?
Powerful and powerless.
Yep.
That's the essence of it. And I think part of the essential question in many societies right now is why groups of people who face discrimination can't come together to find a common cause and to take on majority rule. And I think we're seeing this all over the world. And it gets back to me, in many instances, to a circumstance where people are scrambling to survive. People don't know. Demonetization, writes this large, but it's the truth on a daily basis through, for people without affluence and assets in many parts of the world. Every day you're getting up and trying to invent this tiny place where what you can do and what the market, the fickle market needs, you're trying to figure out where that place is that it intersects. So much of your energy comes in securing clean water, making sure that you resist the effects of the public health catastrophe. How much energy do you have then to cross lines of caste, of religion, and to find what is genuine common interest?
So I want to bring us back to the idea of the state, because the primary obligation of any state is to, of course, to maintain law and order, but also to protect rights. Now, if we look at the Indian context, we do know that the media is feeling subdued or is being co-opted. It is acquiescent. It is willing to play the line that its presumed idea about what the nation wants, it wants to play along with that line. The civil society is increasingly facing restrictions. It's very hard for NGOs and civil society groups to raise funds internally, forget about externally. And the third is the judiciary, which is the bulwark, which is supposed to protect rights. Again, that is under threat in the sense that vacancies are not being filled, which in fact leads to an erosion of the sense of justice. So who's going to do the protection of minorities when we want to have some bulwark, some protection against the majoritarian trend?
Well, Salil, there are minorities and minorities. And in fact, it might be argued in the circumstances of India that what is a minority?
I think there's only one minority in India, which is the Indians.
Well, I think that is probably well said.
No, I'm not being facetious, I mean it.
No, that to me appears to be the problem. Now, again, I will set it in the way I look at it, these problems. Again, go back to 1990. Came globalization. With globalization came, in India, the world was, Tom Friedman declared that the world was flat. Before him, 10 years before him, my Fukuyama had already announced end of history. And the funny thing is that these pundits remain. They keep coming back. They recycle. They keep going wrong, and then they'll be back again. They'll go and write a book and then come back and resume. Now, what happened is you had globalization. Everyone was infected. There was one sole superpower. We were all linked to that grid. The Bombay Ink in India, which is Indian industry, and the dream scenario was a good two-party system. That's a dream scenario. It is not there in India, but the dream you can see in the projection in the news, that somehow it should be one and the other. So that the puppeteer up there, which is big industry, which finances the crony capitalism, I mean, to be absolutely straightforward, crony capitalism, heads, I win, tails, you lose. If it is one party, I have all the investments in there. If it is the other party, I have all the investments in there. Now, over a period of time, the system has putrefied. People are not as, because with globalization came the information explosion. People saw their circumstance, and they realized that they are wanting to get out of this two-party jail, imprisonment, everywhere, including the United States of America. There is this great urge to get out and look for new things. So in India, you may not like him, you may dislike him. Immediately in the aftermath of Narendra Modi's victory in 2004 May, you had elections in Delhi, and a completely new novice came up. They said, we'll finish him. He came up again, 67 out of 70 seats. And now he may, take my word, win in Punjab. What is it? Not because Kejriwal is the answer, but people are looking for something new. Something that doesn't look like the old politician. They hate politicians. Politician has become a bad word, a bad image. And that is why someone said on this platform yesterday that Trump won because he doesn't look like a politician. I think that was fairly well said. And in this framework, you have a complete and total disenchantment with the liberal order. What you call the liberal order, that itself has to be decoded and understood. What was it? There is a complete and total disenchantment with all that we have lived with for the last 70 years. And now the people are looking for something new. Whether it is Duterte, Rodriguez Duterte, he comes to power, he kills 10,000 people, and the country becomes drug-free. He says, well, if my cops could not kill, I told them I pulled out my revolver and I shot them. Says the president of Philippines. Well, everyone says, go finish him off. Silence him through all the world bodies. And they discovered, lo and behold, that he has 96% rating in his country. You can't, I mean, you're talking of populism, here it is.
Yeah.
And So these are some of the things that we will have to cobwebs, that we'll have to clear if we are to arrive at any consensus. I think the whole idea of liberal democracy is very much in question.
So I want to build on that, and ask you this question about the whole so-called great liberal failure, because that's the thing I kept hearing when I was in London during the Brexit vote, and you hear about it in the United States too, that Trump in a sense represents those voiceless people who have finally found a voice.
What's really striking about, if you look closely at the polls in the United States, is that everybody's been paying attention to the working class, white working class people who elect him. He wouldn't be president of the United States. He wouldn't be taking office this week if it wasn't for educated people, educated white people. And there was very much a sense in the United States that there was this sense that white people felt threatened by the Obama presidency. You cannot underestimate the power of racism in determining that election. But one thing that I want to say about end of liberalism arguments, that in both in India and the United States, it's not, what happened was that you had elite and inadequate representatives of liberalism. In Hillary Clinton and Rahul Gandhi, you had very flawed candidates who could not be, who could not conceivably, as many gyrations as they made, convince the public that they were conversant with the true needs of people in a time of acute instability. And I think that I think that there's an instinct in media and in punditry to, it's always the end of something. There's always a hot totalizing tape. But I think that that what I hope in the United States, you think about the emergency and what happened after the emergency. You had a crisis, and what it ended up doing was deepening the spirit of democracy. People, when they realized what they were in for, took on the power to throw the people out. So I think we can be very fast to see the end of something when really you're seeing the beginning of a cycle of resistance.
I have a question which is about India and its near abroad. And by that I primarily mean Pakistan and Bangladesh, but also to some extent Myanmar, and I'll explain why. And which is the way India looks at India, which itself has a spotty record on, to put it politely, protection of minorities, how it has started looking at lately protection of minorities in the region. There is a proposal to give fast-track citizenship at a low cost to religious minorities from the neighborhood, which might apply for either asylum or citizenship in India. And presumably this is meant for Hindus and Sikhs from Pakistan or Hindus from Bangladesh. I'm not sure whether the generosity extends to Shias and Ahmadis in Pakistan, or gay activists in Pakistan, or bloggers who are atheists in Bangladesh, or for that matter the Rohingyas of Myanmar. Now India hasn't signed the 1951 Refugee Convention nor the 1967 Protocol, and yet in the past its record has been exemplary. Whether you're a Tibetan, you're a Sri Lankan Tamil, whether you're a Bangladeshi refugee during 71, whether you're an Afghan or a Rohingya, India has been generous. So why this change? Is it driven by majoritarian impulses within India?
That's a tricky one. Salil, the issue is this, that there is, not very far in the distance, is an event called the partition of India. And the shadow of that partition is very much there. It conditions everything. Now what we mentioned, I think three of us agreed on the fact that here in India at least, who is the majority and who is the minority? What is the project that is being undertaken at the moment? Let me again place this issue in the shadow of the partition of India in 1947. What is happening? In 1947, we in India trapped ourselves into a triangle. We trapped ourselves into a triangle. What is that triangle? The triangle is New Delhi, Srinagar, India, Pakistan, Hindu, Muslim, is one complex of issues. Let me repeat it. Imagine a triangle. New Delhi, Srinagar, India, Pakistan, Hindu, Muslim. This is one complex of issues. Anyone who charges off to Srinagar pretending to solve the issues there is fooling you and me and himself, because it is not going to happen. You proceed, you have to bring Pakistan in. Once you bring Pakistan in, the Hindu-Muslim temperature in the country comes down. The Hindu-Muslim temperature in the country comes down, your entire project of Hindu consolidation is hit for a 6. That is the trap in which you are. Hindu consolidation, which means what? Is putting together all these niggly castes that we talk about. They have to be somehow put together into a nation. And this shadow of the partition, the other, the Muslim, comes in handy in that project where we are trapped. There is, I don't see, there's no exit. How do you get out of it? I would like people here, you, to give me an answer. That is the trap in which we are. And in the process, do you think all the castes are going to be knitted together into, I don't know. This is an eternal game. It goes on, there's no end to it. Thank you.
That's pretty grim. No, that's pretty grim, yes. I've just been told we have to be watchful of the time, so I'm going to skip to the next part, which was about minorities in the United States. Do you think under the Trump presidency are people going to be safe?
I think that the bitter racist campaign unleashed dark sensibilities that had been suppressed, actively suppressed by civil society and government action over the course of decades. I think I think it's a shocking and grievous situation, and but I do think that what is solidified is the unity of people who are coming together in protest, including very powerfully at the moment of the inauguration. The inauguration is going to be, you know, you may see the mobilization of more protesters than celebrants. And again, it gets back to things like the emergency. What, you know, when one of the most significant groups of voters, significant groups in the American electorate, were the people who didn't turn out in the polls. There are so many people, well, you know, it's the same thing in the UK, as you know. There were so many people who felt that the election was irrelevant to their well-being. And what happens when you have these victories of majoritarians like in Brexit and Trump is that people start to see, women start to realize that their access to birth control and abortion is at risk. Many people like myself who have very expensive and debilitating medical conditions that aren't covered by insurance realize that our very livelihoods and lives are under threat. And you know, so many people who sat it out, who felt that politics, it's what we were talking about earlier, about that so many people have lost faith in their institutions because the institutions aren't answering their urgent and legitimate concerns. But what they're beginning to see is that sitting it out isn't a viable option either. That, you know, for all the cynicism people have about the current state of politics, it could get worse.
I agree with all that you said. I have a small formulation on the Trump victory, and which is, if you are going to make Bernie Sanders impossible, if you make Bernie Sanders impossible, you make Trump inevitable. In the context, particularly in the context of this wave globally against the establishment, against the establishments everywhere. England, Brexit, part of it. What's going on in Spain, in Europe, and what will happen in France.
And Netherlands, probably.
And Netherlands also. The anti-establishment, but what is happening is something very interesting. Whenever the establishment is assaulted by the right and the left, the establishment itself tends to tip the scale in favor of the right. This is what has happened, say, in Spain. To keep Podemos out, the socialists and the El Pais and all that group have got together, and Leroy is now the Prime Minister again. Wherever the establishment is assaulted from the left and the right, the establishment itself tends to tip the scale in favor of what they consider is the lesser evil, namely the right. Therefore, hence Trump. I mean, in the context, there are other contexts elsewhere. So when Hillary Clinton says, I know I have a problem with my image, I know I have people don't trust me, but vote for me. I know I have goofed in Benghazi, but vote for me. I know there is an issue on my emails, but vote for me. I am nothing but the epitome of the very establishment that the world is opposed to, but vote for me. I mean, it was so logical as far as I'm concerned. It was so illogical that somehow this rabbit was going to be pulled out of the rat when there was no logic to it. But Trump is this and Trump is that. Of course, I don't know what Trump is. We never knew what Modi was. And we never knew what Rodriguez is.
Well, we knew Modi from 2002, but anyway. I've been told we have about 7 or 8 minutes, so I do have a few questions, but let's have some questions from the audience. And Karthika set a very good example, so I'm going to look at up there first, if there's any question from the top.
Yes, sir, why cowboys are ruling the countries now? Here we can see Modi, there Duterte, there Trump. Is it the age of cowboys? People who likes cows and all.
Well, Saeed just told me that cowboys came with Reagan, and I tend to be hesitant about speaking about cows at this moment in India. Someone here, please, yeah.
Good afternoon, everyone. Myself, Abdullah from Kerala. So in India, Hindus are majorities. The main 3 religions, Islam, Christianity and Hinduism. And in India, Hindus are majority and Muslims and Christians are minorities. So there is more conflicts between Hindus and Muslims rather than more than Hindus and Christians. And the other one is Indian Muslims and the Pakistan Hindus, are them in the same bus or are them in the same situation? I just want to know it.
So the question being?
Question be Indian Muslims and the Pakistani Hindus, are them in the same bus or are them in the same situation?
Are they similar? Indian Muslims, and you've just written about the other.
You are talking about 180 million Muslims in India. You are talking about the world's second largest Muslim population, which is in India. The first being Indonesia, which is 275 million, is Indonesia. Having said that, there is no such thing as a Muslim monolith anywhere. The Muslims in Marrakesh are different from the Muslims in Riyadh. That is on the global scale. But here, the Mapelas are different from the Bengali Muslims, are different from the Labbais here, are different from, I mean, from the Kilakarai Muslims with whom I have dealt when I used to need foreign exchange, when foreign exchange was difficult to obtain. So there is no such thing as a Muslim monolith. You are, I imagine, should be culturally homogeneous with the area where you are. Your religion is yours, but the culture, the language you speak, the food you eat, the way you greet each other is what defines you. Your faith is yours, which is your private. It's very, it has to be placed a very high premium on that. But having said that, and to compare Hindus in Pakistan and you know, it's a non sequitur. It doesn't make any sense really, because here there is a problem. There is a serious problem I told you about this triangle, and how you cope with it in your little area, in your area is the trick, not on the mega scale in wherever you are.
I think we have 5 more minutes, so I'm going to take your question. And the lady here, the only thing I would like to add to what you said is how difficult it is to make generalizations. I think it was Neeraj Chaudhary said that in India, even exceptions run into millions. So, yeah.
Just to go back to Trump again, I was wondering if the obvious collusion between Debbie Wasserman Schultz and the DNC, along with the liberal media in America, was equally responsible for the independents who voted for Bernie Sanders to have gone along with the Trump train, so to speak. Because there's no way, I think, that Donald Trump could have won states like Florida without independents coming to the picture, who I think the Democrats took for granted. So my question is basically, do you think that this collusion between the liberal media and the DNC was equally responsible for Trump winning?
Yeah, I think it's more complicated than that. I think that the media in the United States is fairly diverse. What I do think is that many people in Washington felt that Hillary Clinton was a foregone conclusion, and they invested more of their resources in her. And I think that's, you know, again, when I talk about this, it's not just the end of liberalism. It was what you had in the United States was a candidate of the elite who wasn't plausible as a change candidate and a protest candidate, and it was easier to see that from outside places like Washington than it was from inside it. Inside it, there was the illusion that she could be seen as somebody who reached people who were really affected by economic uncertainty, but outside in these non-elite circles, that was an implausibility.
Thank you.
You see, one of the great tragedies of the last 20 years or so has been the from gradual to abysmal decline of the credibility of the Western media and the copycat media everywhere. There is a decline. No one believes the media anymore. So therefore, while the media in the United States, except with the exception of Fox, who supported Trump, it stood foursquare behind Hillary Clinton. And what was the result? You saw the result. Why has this happened? Well, there's no time for it, otherwise I could dilate on that one also. The credibility of the Western media is in question, and people do not believe it any longer.
Thank you. That's a perfect segue into the question that I have. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the protection of minority in the context of gender, because you rightly brought up the issue of Hillary Clinton saying, I did this, so please vote for me, I did this. Trump, on the other hand, blatantly doesn't show his taxes, degrades women, does everything negative, and yet the media is culpable in framing the story of each of these candidates. So I actually find it very interesting to hear from both of you on how the media played a role in actually, I think, creating a fairly negative picture of the first female nominee of the United States of America.
Well, I should say that I don't cover politics, so I'm a consumer of the news as much as, and I think there was a great deal of sexism in the coverage of Hillary Clinton. At the same time, I feel that that because it was a time. But what was needed in this election was a change candidate, and she wasn't it. And you know, we also have to acknowledge the reality, which is that she came into power and national prominence because of her husband. So there's a way in which we can raise her up after the fact as a pure self-made feminist icon, and that's not really the story. But I want to say something a little bit different about, I mean, in a way I feel like this discussion has been at 30,000 feet. In a way I want to just bring it to the ground a little bit. What I see about protection of the rights of women, particularly poor women, is this. In many countries of the world, they're the most beautiful, conscientious laws to protect minorities. And India's laws in some ways have been models for the world. But I'll just, when I was working on researching my book, I was looking at cases in which people who were victimized received justice. And I started looking at cases, and I'll give you just one example. There was a young woman named Deepa. She was barely 12. She was selling flowers in Mumbai near the airport, and she was raped by a policeman. The rape was discovered by an auto rickshaw driver, and it became a case that was celebrated. It was exposed in the media. It became a human rights case. She received a huge settlement. The case was resolved. It was an example of the system working. But when I actually sought her out, what I found out was that she never got a cent. Her mother died of the stress of trying to pursue it. Her father died, and she ended up destitute, stigmatized, married off, sent to a village where her husband treated her as what he considered damaged goods. So what becomes, you know, what looks like a triumph of the human rights apparatus in the media actually hides another atrocity, which is the lack of, you know, and that gets to what the media, I mean, you're talking about the flaws of the media. That is an essential flaw of the media, is that there's no accountability, even when these beautiful laws exist on the books.
Just quickly. No, I personally think, thank you. I believe that that one cause certainly was injured, was harmed with Hillary's defeat. I think this whole issue of women and that became, it is still, in my view, all a bit ambiguous. Let him come into being on the 20th. Let us see how far he goes. I mean, so far in the cabinet, he has taken some women. Let us see how far he goes, because let us not prejudge him, because we have to live with him for the next 4 years. Although
I think there's enough evidence to prejudge him.
I like to imagine that he is, in historical terms, a semi-finalist. The finals will be in 2020.
Optimism is a good thing, I suppose. I just want to add one point. I'm so glad, Katherine, that you brought in the issue of the marginalized. And I just wanted all of us to remember what you said earlier on, that this is not really about majority and minority, but this is really about those with power and those without. Very often, it's those without power who are the majority. We know it in South Africa, we know it with the case of Dalits and many other situations. Just let's remember that when we grapple with these profound questions. Thank you.
Thank you for the valuable insight, Ms. Boo, Mr. Naqvi, and Mr. Tripathi.